I could go back in time on day one. Firstly, always babysit acid. I left those parts of the GPU in way too long, and I almost didn't recover from that. So now we're going to have to really clean this up. I'm really happy with how the paint turned out, like not just the powder coat, but the spray paint. It looks really good for all the matte black, and I like how the fans came out too. Those worked out. Number two, I would say, woodworking is not universal. It depends on the wood. Don't go with Purple Heart. It's extremely hard to work with. It was so hard to work with. It was really rewarding, but I mean, it was so hard on every level. Milling it was hard. Cutting it was hard. Inserting those brass taps was almost impossible without splitting and breaking it. It was just really hard to work with, but it does look nice. Well, the wild card in the build was the SSD because my original plan was to use a mini SSD right on the motherboard, but I had to go to a full 2.5-inch SSD, which means that I need to add a bunch more cables to the build. And I placed the SSD early in the build behind the power supply, but when it came down to actually sleeving and wiring everything, I could not get the cable for the SSD, the data cable, to bend appropriately. It put too much stress on the card, so as a parent, I needed to move it. So what did I ended up doing is I placed the SSD underneath the power supply, and I routed the wires a little bit differently, and it looked much more natural. It's kind of hidden under the 24-pin cable loom, and it just looks a lot better there. Sleeving is a major part of the build. It's the heart of everything you're doing. It's tying everything together. It's putting electricity into your parts. It's very important to get it to look right. And I wanted to do something that was unique. After getting the powder coat in that awesome kind of silver crinkle hammer tone with the black, that silver vein, black just was a little bit too boring, I thought. And I kind of wanted to bridge that color into the build more. So I ended up actually getting 3 different shades of gray from $1 Million PC. So I wanted to make it more of a bridge between the hard black and that silver. So I kind of averaged it out. But this was the hardest part of the build by far. And not just in terms of time, but in emotional frustration and in really just difficulty calculating it all out. Because I knew I had to do this complex curve. And if I kept every wire the same length, it just was not going to look good once it got bent into place. So I made sure and measured everything out. The sleeving by itself, looks nice, and there's different ways of making sure you can get it grouped together nicely. But I had the idea from Dave, and I kind of want to do a tribute to him. So I took kind of his idea of his fork rings, and I applied it to the build. That's not what you use those for. But I found that I had these PCIe slot covers, these dust covers, and they're perforated and they were chrome. They looked real nice. Actually, they're not chrome. That's an important feature. They're like a satin reflective metal. And I really like how they look because they provide enough contrast to the design without standing out so much that they're just eyesores. As far as spacing goes, they're mostly functional, and then I just kind of tweaked them so they looked balanced as far as how many I used. I had to clamp them in places that actually made sure the wires weren't tugging too hard in the graphics card or separated loom bundles and looked good. But I was also battling the fact that I just have no space in this build to put them. Once I got the system assembled and the wires in place, I was going to step back and say I was done, but it was apparent that I was not, because although the GPU looked like I want it to look, it didn't really tie in smoothly into the rest of the build. And it was really because of the PCB on the back. So I decided I was going to do a backplate. I just found some scrap metal from another computer mod I did a while back, and I'm going to hack it up. And I basically used a 2x4 and a bench and a hammer and a file, and it took many tries to get it right, and I really wanted to kind of wrap around the card and wrap into the system as much as possible. So that required a lot of bending. Eventually, it looked exactly like I wanted to. It covers the edges of the card, so it looks like it's actually part of the card rather than just some plate covering the back. It also wraps into the PC. It goes behind the slot cover, which also helps stabilize the card even further. So everything is really tight, really well assembled, and quite durable. It's still a piece of art. It's still a sculpture. It's not meant to travel and be thrown around, but neither is it something so delicate that, touching it is going to break it. I think this project has been absolutely awesome because it's been a catalyst of self-growth, especially in modding for me. I like the fact that when I look at my mod, I'm not seeing my mod. I'm not seeing the metal and the wood and all that. I'm kind of seeing, oh, that was my time over at the Dado furniture store. Oh, those were the pieces that Patrick helped me cut, and we had fun over that, or came over a couple beers with my friends at the powder coat place, and how Chris pulled it through in the end, and it looks beautiful. So that's what I see when I look at the mod. I look at the adventure that went into building it. I want people to look at the build, and I hope that it makes them do a double take and kind of look at the overall design and how integrated it is, but how just dynamic the build is as well. So it's always fun to see what people point out and what people focus on, even when it's critical. I like when people are looking at something. But what's really fun for me is doing the photography, because for the first time I get to look at my mod kind of how a viewer would look at the mod as an art piece. So I love taking the pictures, and I love putting them in the computer and seeing the mod as a final integrated art piece. So that's one of the highlights of the build for me. Not just because it's done, but well, because it is done, I guess. I'm hoping that they'll take away from this, more than anything else, the idea that you don't have to build computers in the same way as everybody else. You can arrange parts in however manner that you want. I like it. That's why. Sometimes you just do something because you like it. Do you have any boogers hanging from my nose?
Remember to talk to the camera.
What now?
Talk to Robin. Robin.